When does life begin? More specifically, when does human life begin? There are many people who will claim that you can't answer that question with science, that you need to turn to religion or philosophy, and so it's kind of irrelevant. But that's not true. You can answer it with science, and I'm going to in this video. So make sure you stay around and check out all the sources that I provide. The reason this is important is because if you don't know what you're talking about, you're going to look like an idiot, just like Cenk Uygur.
I think that sperm, those are humans.
Sure.
It's a living thing.
That's a fact.
So
That's a scientific fact.
It is a scientific fact.
The sperm has met the egg and now you have a zygote. You say, well, that's obviously life if you're in the anti-choice category, anti-abortion, etc. Well, why is that obvious?
That's right. I take every opportunity I can to make fun of him because he is ridiculous. So let's just jump right in with the sources. How do we know life begins at conception? Well, first off, because biologists say it does. There was a study done where over 5,000 biologists were surveyed and asked when human life begins. He surveyed more than 5,000 biologists from over 1,000 institutions all around the world. The vast majority of them, 96%, affirmed that a human's life begins at fertilization. Only 4% rejected that view. That is almost a consensus right there. By and large, biologists agree that life begins at conception. It's also important to note that this cannot be dismissed as pro-life propaganda. The vast majority of those biologists who responded were pro-choice liberal Democrats. 85% of them were pro-choice. So it's not as if this survey was overpopulated with those who are pro-life. If anything, it's the opposite, and yet they still acknowledged that life begins at conception. Also, if you look at the way some of the biologists responded to this survey, it becomes abundantly clear they are not pro-life. And in many instances, they didn't want to think that their answer could be used in a pro-life way. So maybe you don't think a survey is good enough and you want more hard evidence. Well, let's look at that. The following sources I'm going to use all come from this website. It's a list of sources put together by Dr. Maureen Kondik, an associate professor of neurobiology at the University of Utah. It consists of 10 medical textbooks and 51 peer-reviewed scientific articles. So if you ever have any questions about when life begins or how to prove it begins at fertilization, this is the first place you should go, after my video, of course. Feel free to share my video with anyone who disagrees. So let's just start looking at some of these sources. I actually looked up the original works to verify that the citations were correct. So let's start with 2 textbooks. The first one is an embryology textbook called The Developing Human. So if it's about embryology, you think they'd know a lot about when life begins and development and all of that stuff. And they do. The second chapter starts like this. Human development begins at fertilization. This highly specialized cell marks the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. This paragraph has 2 pieces of information that are really important. First, human development begins at fertilization. What that means is that life begins at fertilization. Human life. You can't develop unless life is already there. Also, it says that marks the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. Fertilization is when you came into existence. Now, if you are religious, you probably believe that your spirit existed beforehand or something of that nature, and that's fine. But if we're talking about your physical body, your physical being, that began at the moment of fertilization. It didn't exist before. Let's look at a second embryology textbook. This one called Medical Embryology. Not the cleverest name, but whatever. They talk about development begins with fertilization, the same basic idea, and then the main results of fertilization are as follows. Determination of the sex of the new individual. Once again, fertilization is when you began as a unique individual being. You didn't exist as a sperm, you did not exist as an egg, you exist as an embryo or a zygote, however you want to define it. That happened at fertilization, not before. Now maybe you think these textbooks aren't good enough. Well, let's look at some peer-reviewed scientific papers. The 2 that I'm going to show both come from Nature. And no, not that Nature. Nature is one of the most well-respected and renowned research journals in the entire world. So let's look at these. The first one has a very long name. It almost seems like a tongue twister. But the name itself is irrelevant. What we care about is what it says in the abstract, because that is where it brings up this important piece of information. It talks about when a sperm and an egg meet, and it says, quote, "They fuse to form a new generation of life." They did not exist as life beforehand. They exist now as a new generation of life. And that just means the exact same thing we've already seen. Life begins at conception, and that marks the beginning of a new, unique individual who has never been seen before and will never be seen again. And now another paper from Nature with also a very interesting name has a very similar premise in the abstract. It says the life cycle of mammals begins when a sperm enters a cell. That's when life begins for all of us. We became unique individuals with life at fertilization. All of these are saying the exact same thing. In case you want more, another book, The Zygote, is the beginning of a new human being. Or if we want another paper, recognition between sperm and the egg surface marks the beginning of life in all sexually reproducing organisms. There is virtually no way that you can in good conscience look at all of these sources and still somehow argue life does not begin at conception, because it very clearly does. And if you still don't believe me, look up these sources on your own. Try and convince yourself that it's true, because that's what the science is saying. As an example of someone else you don't want to be and why it's really important you know what you're talking about, recently I got into an argument on Facebook about when life begins. And they obviously did not know what they were talking about. Even after I shared these very sources, they didn't take any of that into consideration. First, I said a fetus isn't a baby or a person. It's an intermediate form of human life, just like a sperm or ovum. First off, I don't really understand what's an intermediate form of human life. A sperm is not a human life, but a fetus is. It's fairly simple. And then when I pointed that out, he continued, sperm and ova are individual living human beings by literal definition of those words. They're not people. I think the same is true of a fetus. Life itself doesn't begin and end. It's a process, a cycle. A person's life begins and ends. Mine began on my birthday. We've seen this multiple times in this video, that an embryo or a fetus is just a developmental stage of a human being. Sperm is not human. A fetus, an embryo, a zygote, that is a human being, just in a very early stage of development, as all of these sources have agreed. Also, life beginning on your birthday makes absolutely no sense. It's not as if the process of delivery somehow imbues you with the magical power of life. I hope this video has been informative, and I really hope it makes it so you don't act like these people. Know what you're talking about, know the science, and try and be smart about it. And if you ever get into an argument with someone about what is a life and when it begins, first, you should share this video because I'd really appreciate that. But if that doesn't work, all the sources I mentioned in here and plenty more are down below. That website is an incredible tool for you to have. If anyone's ever given you flack, just show that to them and there's really no way they can dispute that. Or, like he did here, you can just ignore it completely and try and pretend it never happened. That's more likely. Anyway, before you take off, please subscribe, leave a like or a comment, check out some of my other videos that maybe you haven't seen, and I'll see you next time.